The worst part wasn't that my husband forgot our anniversary again. The worst part was that I wasn't surprised anymore. On the morning of our 45th wedding anniversary, I woke up before sunrise and lay still for a moment, listening to the quiet hum of the air conditioner and the distant sound of birds outside our bedroom window. For just a few seconds, I let myself believe that this year might be different. Maybe Robert had remembered. Maybe there would be flowers waiting in the kitchen. Maybe there would be a card on the table, or even a simple, happy anniversary, Helen. I got dressed carefully that morning. I chose the navy blue dress Robert once told me brought out the color of my eyes. That compliment had been more than 20 years ago, but I remembered it anyway. Some memories stay with you because no new ones ever replace them. I spent the afternoon preparing for dinner. I made his favorite roast, set out our best china, and lit 2 candles in the dining room. The table looked beautiful. It looked like it belonged to a couple still celebrating a life together. At 5 o'clock, I checked my phone. Nothing. At 6 o'clock, I checked again. Still nothing. By 7, the food was getting cold. I finally called Robert. The call went straight to voicemail. 10 minutes later, my phone buzzed. Relief washed over me for half a second. Then I read the message. Running late. Golf went longer than expected. Don't wait up. That was it. No mention of our anniversary. No apology. No acknowledgement of the date that had once meant everything to both of us. I stared at the screen until the words blurred. Then I quietly set the phone face down on the table. The candles continued burning between 2 untouched plates. The house felt larger than usual, empty in a way that had nothing to do with square footage. I sat there alone for nearly an hour before I finally stood up. I wrapped the roast in foil and placed it in the refrigerator. I washed the dishes I had never used. I blew out the candles. One by one. The second flame took a little longer to disappear. Something about that made my chest ache. I couldn't bear staying inside another minute, so I grabbed my coat and drove into town. The streets were busy with couples heading to restaurants, laughing together beneath the warm glow of storefront lights. I parked near a small family-owned restaurant we used to visit years ago. I wasn't hungry. I just didn't want to sit alone in my house. The hostess seated me by a window. I ordered coffee and watched people pass outside. A young couple shared a dessert. An older man held his wife's hand as they crossed the street. I looked away. When the check finally arrived, I reached for my purse. But the waitress smiled and shook her head. It's already been taken care of, she said. Confused, I looked up. By who? The waitress pointed toward the front door. He just left. On the table beside the receipt was a folded card. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it. Inside, written in neat handwriting, were 7 words that would change everything. Nobody deserves to celebrate alone tonight. I sat there for a long moment, staring at those 7 words. Nobody deserves to celebrate alone tonight. The handwriting was careful, steady, almost old-fashioned. Not rushed. Not casual. Whoever had written it had taken the time to think about every word. I looked toward the door, half expecting the stranger to walk back in, but the sidewalk outside was already crowded with people moving through the evening. Cars rolled past. Restaurant lights reflected against the glass. Whoever he was gone. The waitress returned and refilled my coffee. Did he leave a name? I asked. She shook her head. No, ma'am. He just asked for your check and handed me the card. I smiled politely and thanked her. Then I folded the note and slipped it into my purse. On the drive home, I kept thinking about it. Not because someone had paid for my dinner. It was because a complete stranger had noticed something that the people closest to me had not. The house was dark when I returned. Robert still was not home. I hung my coat by the front door and stood quietly in the kitchen. The anniversary cake sat untouched on the counter where I had left it that morning. White frosting, blue lettering, 45 years together. I stared at it for a few seconds before placing it in the refrigerator beside the leftover roast. The refrigerator light illuminated the shelves briefly before the door clicked shut. Somehow that small sound felt louder than it should have. I went upstairs and changed into my pajamas. Robert arrived nearly an hour later. I heard the garage door open, then his footsteps, then the television downstairs. No apology, no explanation, nothing. He did not even come upstairs to say goodnight. I lay awake staring at the ceiling. Sleep refused to come. Instead, memories began arriving one after another. Not dramatic memories, small ones, the kind people rarely talk about. My 65th birthday, when Robert spent the evening watching a football game and remembered the date only after our son called. The anniversary before that, when he bought flowers at a gas station the next morning because he had forgotten the day before. The Christmas dinner where he thanked everyone at the table except me for organizing the entire gathering. At the time, I had always explained it away. He was tired. He was busy. He had a lot on his mind. That was what I told myself, over and over again. But lying there in the darkness, another thought slowly appeared. What if forgetting was not the problem? What if remembering simply was not important to him? The question settled heavily in my chest. I turned onto my side and glanced at the empty space beside me. Robert had fallen asleep in his recliner downstairs again. Outside, rain began tapping softly against the window. I listened to it for a while. Then I reached into my purse, removed the folded card, and read the message one more time beneath the glow of my bedside lamp. Nobody deserves to celebrate alone tonight. For some reason, those words hurt more than anything that had happened all day. Because deep down, I realized I had been celebrating alone for much longer than one night. The next morning, I woke up feeling strangely restless. Not angry, not even sad, just aware. It was as if someone had quietly turned on a light in a room I had been sitting in for years without noticing how dark it had become. Robert was already gone when I came downstairs. A coffee cup sat in the sink. The newspaper was spread across the kitchen table. There was no note, no mention of the anniversary, no acknowledgement that anything unusual had happened at all. I stood there for a moment looking at the empty chair where he normally sat. Then I poured myself a cup of coffee and carried it to the back porch. The air was cool for early spring. A light breeze moved through the maple trees behind our house. I reached into my pocket and unfolded the card again. I had read it at least a dozen times since the night before. Nobody deserves to celebrate alone tonight. Such a simple sentence. Yet it kept echoing in my mind. Around noon, I found myself driving back toward town without really planning to. Part of me wanted answers. Another part simply wanted to leave the house. I parked near the same restaurant and walked slowly along Main Street. The sidewalks were busy with people carrying shopping bags and stopping at outdoor cafes. Life moved around me the way it always had. For years, I had walked through days like this focused entirely on other people. Robert, our son Daniel, our daughter-in-law Emily, birthdays, holidays, appointments, family dinners. Somewhere along the way, I had stopped noticing myself. I wandered into the public library, a place I had not visited in months. The familiar scent of books and polished wood immediately settled something inside me. I spent nearly an hour browsing the shelves before selecting a novel and finding a quiet chair near the front windows. As I sat down, a voice nearby caught my attention. I thought I might see you again. I looked up. My heart skipped slightly. Standing a few feet away was the man from the restaurant. Or at least I assumed it was him. He appeared to be around my age, maybe 70. Silver hair, kind eyes, a navy sweater over a collared shirt. Nothing extraordinary, yet there was something calm about him. Familiar, even though we had never properly met. You paid for my dinner, I said. He smiled gently. I did. Why? His expression softened. Because I saw someone sitting alone on a night when she should not have been. I stared at him for a moment, unsure what to say. Most people avoided uncomfortable truths. This man had simply spoken one out loud. I am Michael Turner, he said, extending his hand. Helen Parker. We shook hands. His grip was warm and steady. Then he surprised me again. Happy anniversary, Helen. The words hit me harder than they should have. A complete stranger had remembered a date that my own husband had forgotten. For several seconds, I could not speak. Michael seemed to notice. I am sorry, he said quietly. That was probably too personal. I shook my head. No, it is just that nobody else said it. For the first time in a very long time, someone looked directly at me and truly seemed to see me. And somehow, that felt far more unsettling than being ignored. Michael and I ended up talking for nearly an hour that afternoon. Not because either of us planned to. It simply happened. The conversation moved easily, the way conversations sometimes do when there is nothing to prove and no role to perform. We spoke about books first, then travel, then the strange ways life changes without asking permission. He told me he had been widowed for 8 years. His wife, Margaret, had loved gardening and old movies. The way he spoke about her caught my attention. There was sadness there, certainly, but there was also respect, gratitude, memory. He remembered details, small details, the kind that most people forget. Margaret loved yellow roses, he said with a smile. Every spring she planted them along the fence. I still cannot walk past yellow roses without thinking of her. I listened quietly. Then I realized something uncomfortable. Michael remembered his wife the way I had always hoped Robert would remember me. Not with grand gestures. Not expensive gifts. Just attention. Presence. Care. When we finally stood to leave, Michael wished me a good afternoon and headed toward the history section. There was no awkwardness. No expectation. Just simple kindness. Yet his words stayed with me all the way home. That evening, Robert was sitting in his recliner watching television when I walked through the front door. He barely glanced up. "Where have you been?" he asked. "At the library." He nodded absently and returned his attention to the screen. The conversation ended there. Not because he was angry. Not because he was cruel. Because he simply was not interested. I went into the kitchen and began preparing dinner. As I chopped vegetables, memories surfaced again. This time they arrived differently. Clearer. I remembered the summer we visited Cape Cod for our 20th anniversary. I had planned the entire trip, reserved the hotel, mapped out the sightseeing, packed everything. On the second evening, Robert spent most of dinner talking about a business project. He never mentioned our anniversary once. I remembered another year when I bought concert tickets for the two of us. He forgot the date and scheduled a golf outing instead. At the time, I laughed it off. I always laughed it off. Standing there in my kitchen decades later, I finally asked myself a question I had avoided for years. Why? Why had I worked so hard to protect him from disappointment while accepting so much disappointment myself? The answer was uncomfortable. Because I had convinced myself that asking for more would be selfish. Because I believed being a good wife meant accepting whatever attention was left over after everything else had received its share. After dinner, Robert thanked me for the meal and went upstairs. He did not notice that I was unusually quiet. He did not ask what I had done that afternoon. He did not ask how I felt. I sat alone at the table for a long time after he left. The house was silent except for the ticking clock above the stove. Tick, tick, tick. Then I suddenly realized something that made my stomach tighten. Michael had known me for less than 1 hour. Yet during that hour, he had asked me more questions about my life than Robert had asked in the past several years. Over the next few days, I found myself thinking less about Robert and more about the question that had been quietly growing in the back of my mind. What did I actually want from the years I still had ahead of me? It was a strange question because for most of my adult life, my wants had never seemed particularly important. I thought about Robert's schedule, Daniel's needs, family gatherings, holiday plans. There was always something or someone that came first. One Tuesday morning, I opened my kitchen calendar and realized there was an art class being offered at the community center just 6 miles from my house. I stared at the listing for several minutes. Watercolor basics. Every Thursday afternoon. I had loved painting when I was younger. Before marriage. Before children. Before life became a long list of responsibilities. Without giving myself time to reconsider, I picked up the phone and registered. The following Thursday, I walked into the classroom feeling oddly nervous. There were about a dozen people there, most around my age. Some came with friends. Others arrived alone. By the end of the session, my hands were covered with tiny smudges of blue and green paint. And for the first time in years, I had completely lost track of time. When I returned home that evening, Robert was sitting at the kitchen table. "Where have you been?" he asked. "An art class." He looked surprised. "Since when do you take art classes?" The question almost made me laugh. Not because it was funny. Because I realized he genuinely did not know. He had never asked. "Since today," I replied. He nodded slowly and returned to reading the sports section. That weekend, I visited the library again. Partly for books. Partly because I suspected Michael might be there. I told myself it was coincidence, but deep down I knew better. Sure enough, he was sitting near the history shelves. When he saw me, his face brightened. Helen. It was such a simple thing. A person saying my name with genuine warmth. Yet I found myself smiling before I even realized it. We spent nearly an hour talking. Not about marriage. Not about disappointment. We talked about places we had always wanted to visit. Books we enjoyed. Favorite childhood memories. During one part of the conversation, Michael asked what hobbies I had. The question caught me off guard. I opened my mouth to answer and realized I did not know. Not anymore. For years, my identity had been tied to being a wife, a mother, a hostess, a caretaker. Somewhere along the way, the person underneath those roles had become difficult to find. Driving home that afternoon, I felt both sad and hopeful. Sad for everything I had neglected within myself. Hopeful because perhaps it was not too late to rediscover it. When I walked through the front door, Robert barely looked up from the television. For once, his indifference did not hurt as much as it used to. My attention was beginning to shift somewhere new. Not toward another person, toward myself. And that realization felt both unfamiliar and surprisingly powerful. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm I barely recognized. Every Thursday, I attended my watercolor class. Every Saturday, I visited the library. Somewhere in between, I began saying yes to things I would have dismissed before. One afternoon, a woman from my art class invited several of us. 3 days later, everything began to move faster. The silence that had surrounded me for weeks suddenly disappeared. My son called twice before noon. My daughter-in-law left a polite voicemail asking if we could all sit down together and talk. The change was so sudden that it would have seemed strange to anyone who had not lived through the previous months. I listened to the messages while standing at my kitchen counter. Their voices were careful now, friendly, concerned. It was almost convincing. Almost. I deleted neither message. I simply set my phone down and continued making lunch. A turkey sandwich, a cup of soup, the same simple meal I had enjoyed for years. There was something comforting about ordinary routines. They reminded me that not everything had changed. After lunch, I drove across town to meet with an attorney recommended by Harold. The office was located inside a restored brick building near the courthouse. The attorney was a woman about my age named Susan. She greeted me with a firm handshake and listened without interrupting as I explained everything that had happened. I showed her the documents, the notes, the timeline I had carefully assembled. When I finished speaking, she remained silent for several seconds. Then she nodded slowly. "You were wise to document everything," she said. Those words gave me more comfort than she probably realized. For months, I had been treated like someone whose opinions no longer mattered. Sitting in that office, I felt respected again, seen again. Susan reviewed every page with meticulous attention. Occasionally, she underlined a date or circled a name. The longer she examined the records, the more serious her expression became. Finally, she closed the folder and folded her hands. "You have more leverage than they think," she said. I stared at her for a moment. Leverage. It was an interesting word. I had spent most of my life avoiding conflict, solving problems quietly, keeping peace within the family. Yet somewhere along the way, my willingness to be kind had been mistaken for weakness. That misunderstanding was about to become very expensive for someone else. On my drive home, I found myself thinking about my husband. I could almost hear his voice beside me. He had always believed that character revealed itself under pressure. Not during celebrations, not during easy times, during hardship, during moments when doing the right thing required sacrifice. Looking back now, I realized the past few months had revealed everyone's true character, including my own. That evening, another message arrived. This time it was from my son. His words sounded unusually nervous. He wanted to know if we could meet for dinner over the weekend. He said there had been misunderstandings. He said certain things needed clarification. I listened to the recording twice before setting down the phone. For a long moment, I stared out the living room window as the sun dipped below the trees. Then I smiled. Not because I was happy, not because I had forgiven anyone. I smiled because I finally understood why they were reaching out. The truth was no longer hidden behind closed doors. Someone had realized that I knew far more than they ever expected. And for the first time since my husband passed away, the balance of power had quietly shifted. Saturday arrived with clear skies and mild weather. The kind of day that usually brought families together for backyard barbecues and long conversations on the porch. Instead, I found myself driving to a restaurant downtown to meet my son. He had chosen the location himself, which immediately told me he wanted neutral ground. People often do that when they are uncomfortable with the truth. I arrived 10 minutes early and chose a table near the window. By the time he walked through the door, I had already finished half a glass of iced tea. He looked tired, older somehow. The confidence he once carried so naturally seemed diminished. As he approached the table, he offered a nervous smile. I returned a polite one. Nothing more. After we ordered lunch, several moments passed in silence. He stirred his coffee without drinking it, adjusted his napkin, looked toward the window, anywhere except directly at me. Finally, he cleared his throat. He said he regretted how distant things had become. He said communication had broken down. He said everyone had been under tremendous stress after his father's passing. The words sounded carefully prepared, rehearsed, like a speech practiced in front of a mirror. I listened patiently and allowed him to finish. Then I asked a simple question. Why now? The expression on his face changed immediately. Not dramatically, just enough. A brief hesitation. A flicker of uncertainty. He looked down at his coffee before answering. He claimed he wanted to repair the family. He said life was too short to remain divided. Perhaps part of him even believed it. But I had spent months learning the difference between sincerity and convenience. This conversation was not happening because he suddenly missed me. It was happening because circumstances had changed. The waiter delivered our meals. Neither of us touched the food for several minutes. Finally, I opened my purse and removed a single sheet of paper. Not the entire file. Not all the evidence. Just one document. I placed it carefully on the table between us. His eyes moved across the page. The color slowly drained from his face. He read it twice, then a third time. When he looked up, the confidence was completely gone. For the first time in months, I saw honesty breaking through the walls he had built around himself. He asked where I got it. I calmly explained that facts have a way of finding daylight, especially when too many people know the truth. He sat back heavily in his chair and rubbed his forehead. The restaurant noise continued. Around us, dishes clinked. Conversations drifted from nearby tables. Yet our small corner felt strangely quiet. He finally admitted there were things he should have told me, things he should have questioned sooner. He did not offer a complete confession. Not yet. But the first cracks had appeared. That was enough for now. When lunch ended, I paid for my own meal and stood to leave. My son remained seated, staring at the document still resting on the table. Before walking away, I placed my hand gently on his shoulder. Not as a gesture of surrender, not as forgiveness, simply as a reminder. I was still his mother, and despite everything that had happened, I was no longer the person they believed they could ignore. As I stepped outside into the afternoon sunlight, I knew the next conversation would not be with him alone. The real confrontation was finally approaching.